book talk series aims to highlight recently published work by members of the Yale and Newton community, broadly speaking, who have done their thinking and writing locally, often with Yale's archives and collections. It is a forum in which we hope speakers and audiences can have a conversation about sustained modes of intellectual and creative inquiry in the process of researching and crafting arguments, ideas, and language in such a way that engagement with library collections results in a contribution to those collections. In a book, in other words. You can learn more about our continuing lineup by signing up for our mailing list, which you can do at the refreshments table on the other side of the mezzanine. It is amazing to see everyone gathered here today to talk and think about James Baldwin together. It is a special honor to have Trevor Baldwin here with us today. Really thrilled to continue the sustained connection between the Beinecke and Yale Library and the Baldwin family. And we are also thrilled to host a conversation about Baldwin, a love story, the first major biography of James Baldwin in 30 years, and one that endeavors to explore love as a central subject in Baldwin's life and work. It is premised around Baldwin's relationships, romantic and platonic, and tells the story of his life with a focus on how those relationships sustained him, impacted his work and thinking, and otherwise shaped his experience as a human and as a humanist. To that end, it's a remarkable work in its immersive quality, submerging the reader in Baldwin's perspective and shifting frames of mind, while also reflecting on the ways in which he was a thinker ahead of his time and his ability to link seemingly disparate human experiences as part of the process of making sense of his own life. To quote a glowing review in the New York Times by Charles M. Blow, the reader is immersed in the man of Baldwin, the chaos and the preternatural talent, the tragedy and the aching heart, the flesh that itches to be touched, and the voice that will not be suppressed. On top of its achievements as a work of biography, it is also a deep exploration of Baldwin's archives, including those portions housed here at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, which first sparked the author's curiosity in his time as an undergraduate here. I think he will share the specifics of that encounter with everyone and how it contributed to the development of the work being discussed today. But Nicholas Boggs is a writer with many other notable achievements, including a new edition of Baldwin's children's book, Little Man, A Story of Childhood, which he co-edited and helped bring back into circulation after 40 years out of print. And he has contributed to anthologies, including The Cambridge Companion to James Baldwin Now, and Speculative Light, The Arts of Beaufort Delaney and James Baldwin. He is the recipient of numerous writing honors, including a 2023 Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Beinecke Library and Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale, where he was the inaugural recipient of the Walter O. Evans Fellowship, the Schomburg Center Scholars in Residence Program, the National Humanities Center, as well as residencies at Yale and Dell. He received his BA in English from Yale, his MFA in Creative Writing from American University, and his PhD from Columbia. Joining him in conversation is Jacqueline Goldsby, Thomas E. Donnelly Professor of Black Studies and English at Yale University. She specializes in African-American literary criticism and Greek culture studies during the long century of Jim Crow segregation from 1865 to 1965. She is the author of the prize-winning A Spectacular Secret, Lynchian American Life and Literature, and the widely acclaimed Norton Critical edition of James Weldon Johnson's 1912 novel, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. She's currently at work on a book about James Baldwin, The Business of Becoming Jimmy, and has founded 2 archival studies projects, Mapping the Stacks, A Guide to Black Chicago's Hidden Archives, and the Black Bibliography Project, co-directed with Meredith McGill at Rutgers University. Nick and Jackie, it is a thrill to have you both with us here today. Please take it away.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you everybody for being here. You know, we had planned for this conversation to happen in February, but a snowstorm blizzard kept us from coming together. But this is better. This is better. It's a beautiful day, and we're actually in the place where we did so much of the research for this book. And so thank you all for being here. And I want to start by saying thank you to Nick for giving us a new view of Baldwin, giving those of us who either read him for pleasure or for those of us who study and teach him as scholars, for giving us a new way to come at him in all of his complexities and all of the achievements that he carved out for us, both in the way he lived his life and the literary legacy that he left us. I mean, you know, I think I might be, I'm just going to say, maybe one of the few people who's read the book cover to cover already. But I love that it's so big. I love that it's so long. Not only is a testament to your own commitment and diligence and prowess as a researcher, but Baldwin's life is that complex, and you gave it the heft that it deserves. So it's summer reading, and hopefully our conversation today will give you a way into it if you've not already started the book. But I thought I wanted to begin our conversation with an interesting idea that you offered in an interview, because it's such a massive, and I say this with absolute awe and respect, such a massive tome that really reads deftly from the first page to the last. It is a real page turner. But you described yourself as an accidental biographer. Like, what was the accident that led you to write this very brilliant and brave book?
Well, I've since revised that because I thought it was an accident, but actually recently I spoke to my 8th grade English teacher in DC public schools where I first saw James Baldwin's face on the wall drawing, and I was very taken with it, but she told me that actually I repressed this, that I came in the next week in a suit and gave a presentation on his whole life in 8th grade. So I guess it was not an accident, but I just want to thank you, Jackie, for having me. It's really an honor to be in conversation with a scholar I admire so much. I want to thank Trevor Baldwin for being here. There are many friends and family here, so I'm not going to thank them, but I'm going to thank Beinecke Library, Walter Lantz Fellowship, the Gilder Learning Center, Michelle Sachs, and David Blight are here. Thank you for all the support that I've gotten through Yale, actually, since way back in 1993.
And that's a part of the beautiful story of this book. And for any rising seniors in the audience or graduating seniors, your whole entry into the world of Baldwin began during your undergraduate years here, aiming towards a senior thesis book. So can you walk us through how Little Man entered into your academic training here at Yale and how it opened up to the book that we now have?
Sure. So I was an English major at Yale, and at that point, African-American Studies was not a department, it was a program. But I saw all these amazing graduate students walking around campus, like Bernard is here, she's one of them, others, and who were having these incredible conversations, and so I had something to look towards. And I took a class on James Baldwin, the first one at Yale ever devoted just to his work, and he read everything he'd ever written, except this out-of-print children's book. And David Leeming had written his very important 1994 biography, which we all owe so much to. But there were only about 2 paragraphs about Johann Kazak, this French artist. So I wrote him like the second email of my life, literally, saying, do you know anything about Johann Kazak? I sort of suspected that they were not just collaborators, but potentially lovers, and I was curious.
How so? How did that?
Well, he became the godfather to his son, much as he had become the godfather to the love of his life's son, Lucian Hammersberger. And just the language that he was using was very elusive. So I wrote him the email, and he said, I've never met Johann Kazak. I don't know anybody alive who did, and I believe he's dead. And I had gone to Beinecke, and it was an incredible experience just picking up this out-of-print children's book for adults and adults book for children. It was written in Black English. It had mature themes like police surveillance, alcoholism, drug addiction. So I was curious about it both as a formal literary piece, but also as a biographical text. And so a few years later, 2003, I'm getting my PhD at Columbia. I'm in New York. I'm really broke. I'm living in a studio apartment. I write to art historians in Paris saying, do you know anything about this dead French artist named Johann Kazak? I leave my phone number. This is before cell phones. A few weeks later, my landline rings, and there's this raspy French accented voice of this old man saying, I'm Johann Kazak, I'm alive. I'm in Paris. I have many stories to tell you about Jimmy. And that's what set me off. That was a sort of accidental part, I would say. I wanted to bring Old Man back into print. I wanted to tell this one slice of Baldwin's life. But the further I went into it, the more I realized it opened up all kinds of other questions.
Why don't we look at a short clip that will give you a feel for what this amazing, what do you call it, a children's book
for adults and adult book for children. We brought it back into print with Jennifer DeVere Brody in 2018. This is the trailer, 2-minute trailer.
Music all up and down the street. TJ runs it every day. Soon as he get a little bit older, he going to jump the roofs. Blinky, she just looking from across the street. Them eyeglasses blinking just like the sun was hitting you in the eye. WT is 7. It ain't no excuse for him at all, skipping rope and following behind Blinky.
But when the child goes to bed, needs to be talked down, to be talked to the baby talk.
This street long, it real long. It's a little like the street in the movies or on the TV where the cop cars come from that end of the street and then they come from the other end of the street. And the man they come to get, he in one of the houses or he on the fire escape or he on the roof. He's sweating and running and ducking, but he done for. He not going to get off this street alive.
Some travel or books.
You ever have trouble on the books? Yes.
TJ real happy on Sunday mornings when his daddy be home all day and TJ and his mama and daddy all eat breakfast together in the kitchen. TJ's mama is the most beautiful woman in the world. I want you to be proud of your people, TJ's daddy always said. They boss people.
Thank you for. I'm wondering, since recovering from lost work is a really important contribution, scholarly contribution, a contribution to the readers of Baldwin as an editorial project. I'm wondering, can you say a little bit more about what do we learn about Baldwin as a children's book author? Like, what does this book teach us about his vision of craft?
Well, it's dedicated to his nephew, Tijon Curry Smart, who visited him when he was young, and whenever Baldwin would come home to the house he bought his family on 71st Street, this nephew would say, Uncle Jimmy, when are you going to write a book about me? And he said, I'm working on it. And he wasn't working on it, but eventually he wrote it. And he really was considered sort of like a father figure to his nieces and nephews, but also to the children of the world, as Doran Kazak told me. So I think it reveals this kind of deep, avuncular relationship that he had to his family, but also to children in general. I mean, he has so many amazing quotes about the importance of children. And also, I think it's around the same time later he wrote his essay, Black English is in a Language That Tell Me What Is. So it's really about his celebration of the Black vernacular as a form of survival, but also as an aesthetic form. He's able to bring those things together in this book.
But the other achievement of Baldwin, the love story, is the scale up to biography, right? A whole project of not just recovering underread words or differently read words and sources, but amassing that evidence into a story about Baldwin's life. And since we are inviting me, and I thought it would be great because so many epiphanies it seemed that anchor the book happened with the sources that you had access to here. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it all began when I filled out the paper and went down to the glass wall reading room, and they brought out Little Man. But that experience of going into these archives here, and also importantly at the Schomburg, has been one of the honors and excitements of my life. And the archives here have grown over, as you know, over the decades. But one important, very important aspect, and I think Nancy Cools here put together a beautiful exhibition drawing on these letters a couple of years ago. Here, he's writing to his best friend, Mary Painter, the woman he says he would have married if he could have married woman. She's a French economist that he met soon after he moved to Paris. They became basically best friends. But these letters, he wrote her from all over the world. But importantly, his first trip in 1957 to the South. He went there on a magazine assignment. At this point, he really thought of himself as a novelist, an artist, but this was when he realized just the depth of the issues facing America, and that he had a unique opportunity to become, as he put it, a witness. However, this letter is written from the A.G. Gaston Hotel, which of course became an important site for Martin Luther King, sort of headquarters in the South. This is in Birmingham, and Baldwin is actually writing on the stationery to Mary about having these psychosomatic illnesses from fear, he'd never been south before, seeing the burning crosses, reading the KKK pamphlets. And when he arrives back in New York City, I just came from Grand Central, and he writes about arriving back in Grand Central with his suitcase full of manuscripts and documents, and it just burst open in the middle of Grand Central. He did too, emotionally, kind of disappeared for 4 days. So it took a lot of effort, but this was a turning point when he realized that the South was important, and that the Black church, which he had sort of rejected, seeing Martin Luther King in the South reminded him that actually the Black church was a place of community, but also political mobilization.
And that kind of evidence you were able to tap into with his correspondence with Mary.
He goes into great details about how meeting Martin Luther King, but also his fear, all of the fears that overcome him when he's there.
And so Mary Painter becomes an important kind of interlocutor for you and for Baldwin as he kind of lands in Paris in 1948 and is deciding to make his way as a writer. And it's interesting that your biography really picks up with Baldwin as an adult, more so than the beginning of the cradle story. Which is to say, if you can talk a little bit about the structure of the book. I hope you can, it's small, but if you can walk us through the table of contents and how you've organized this book.
Absolutely. So the book is organized in 4 major sections. I call them books, and each one probably is as long as one of those books. So there is a prologue where I begin in his childhood, but I don't begin like James Baldwin was born in 1924. Instead, I begin with this pivotal moment when he's taken to see Betty Davis by his school teacher, and he sees her eyes, and it's this transformative moment for him. He realizes that he's actually not ugly, and that actually his eyes are a source of power. They can be weapons and strangeness, as he puts it, put it to use. But I do cover his childhood. But the first book, one, is Buford, and this begins when Baldwin moves out to Greenwich Village. Buford Delaney, now is a very well-known and important Afro-American painter who's making himself for millions of dollars, but at the time he was this eccentric figure in the village who took Baldwin under his wing and became his spiritual father, as he put it. And they ended up constructing this intense, lifelong bond, kinship structure. Buford eventually followed him to Paris, he followed him up to Istanbul, painted these extraordinary portraits of him throughout his life. He really taught Baldwin 2 things, that a Black man could be an artist, as he put it, and also how important love was to the artistic process and practice. So here we have not the first portrait, but the early portrait of Baldwin, and he's moved to Greenwich Village, and basically Buford is trying to reflect back to Baldwin how he sees him as a young man worthy of love, right? And then the second one has actually never really been seen before, thanks to Sadat Pakai, a Turkish photographer. This is Buford in 1966, work on paper when he visited Baldwin in Istanbul and stayed with him for a summer. And this is actually their living room in the house where they were staying.
And what was Buford kind of last through Baldwin's life as a father figure, as a spiritual mentor? But it's clear that he also loves Baldwin romantically.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know how did that tension play out over the course of their life, and how do you understand Baldwin's greater desire, perhaps, to understand Buford as a mentor, as a spiritual leader, an artistic model?
Yeah, I think this is a good example of something that happened frequently in Baldwin's life, where you have these relationships that might be laced with some erotic interest on his part and the part of the other person, but Baldwin was remarkably able to kind of transform these relationships into the ones that worked for both parties, but also that he needed creatively, right, in order to produce his works. All 4 of these figures, he dedicated novels to them, or he collaborated with them, or as he put it, they saved his life. I mean, he saved their lives as well. He credits Buford with basically saving his life as well. But yes, Buford was interested in him early on, but Baldwin said he couldn't have handled it at the time, and Buford was a very reticent guy, actually. And so it quickly changed into this spiritual father, but like all familial relationships, I can say this with some of my family here, it was complicated, right? And so they had moments where Buford would get very envious of Baldwin's actual lovers, right? And would they get into arguments and fights, and you see these reflected in the letters in the archives. But at the end of the day, it was an incredibly beautiful, sustaining relationship that went all the way up through Buford's death in 1979.
And then another chapter, another book that you constructed in your argument.
Right. Right, and I should note that it's structured through these four major relationships with men. Baldwin's relationships with important women are threaded throughout, like Lorraine Hansberry, Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison. It tells all of these stories, but it focuses on these four because they had been undertold before, and because they were so important to his creative process. Baldwin would go through breakups, and then he would turn it into art. And it wouldn't just be, I'll talk about Lucian in a second, but this happened around the same time. Baldwin's mentor, Richard Wright, Baldwin broke up with him, right, sort of ideologically and aesthetically, in order to write Go Tell It on the Mountain. It was very creatively productive for him to kind of have these somewhat fractious breakups. Lucian Happelsberger he meets a year after he moves to Paris, and Lucian is a young Swiss guy who wants to be a painter, and Baldwin falls ill because he can't finish his novel, really get it started. And Lucian takes him away to his parents' Swiss chalet, pretends he has tuberculosis, and gets some money from his father. And they go several times over the course of a year and a half. The first time he nurses Baldwin back to health. Baldwin doesn't have a title for the novel. He's the only Black person in this Swiss village. He writes about it brilliantly in Stranger in the Village. But at this point, Lucian nurses him back to health, and then they go on a hike. And Baldwin almost slips, supposedly, and Lucian catches him. And then Baldwin looked at the light reflecting on a glacier, and that's when he came up with the title for the novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. The second time he went back, he found the voice for the novel because he brought Bessie Smith records with him, 2 of them, and played them. So the third time he went back, he finished the novel, but he also found out that Lucian's girlfriend was his girlfriend and was pregnant, and they broke up, and that became kind of a model for later for the novel Giovanni's Room.
Where do you see the elements of Baldwin's life? Because that actually invites a question about how do you understand the role of autobiography in Baldwin's fiction, right? And if Lucian gives us a way to think about a novel that many of us have probably read, Giovanni's Room, how do you see that tension playing out in the text itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always dangerous for a biographer to turn to a literary text, or a literary critic to turn to a literary text and say this equals this equals this. I don't think that works. However, at the same time, unlike many novelists, Baldwin was not coy about the relationship between autobiography and his fiction. And in many, many interviews, he talks about how John Bryan's Go Tell It on the Mountain is based on himself, that aspects of David and Giovanni are based on him. Particularly his later novels, which we'll get to, are very, very autobiographical. And Baldwin was very upfront about that. At the same time, he was making key changes and transmuting them into art. Obviously, Giovanni's Room is narrated by a closeted white American male, so it's not Baldwin, right? He's turning it into something else, something with different kinds of insights. Same thing with The Beale Street Could Talk, narrated by a pregnant Black woman, Tish. That's not Baldwin, but it's very much based actually on his personal life as well.
Move to Istanbul, which many of us are aware there's a kind of lore of Baldwin, going to Paris in 1948 to 57, transatlantic commuting, a term I want to come back to a little later. But Paris kind of organizes our sense of Baldwin leaving America. But Istanbul becomes very important to him and the relationships he builds there. So can you talk about that?
Sure. So there's an interlude. We have book 1, Buford, book 2, Lucian. There's an interlude where Baldwin makes his first trip south. He's also in Corsica, which is a whole other interesting story. Book 3 is about Enki Jazar. Now, Magdalena Zaborowska has written an incredibly important book of the Turkish decade. So that's always the go-to text. But I did go over to Istanbul and spent a lot of time researching. My research assistant was Turkish. I took it very, very seriously as an important part of Baldwin's life because, in fact, if you look at the letters or the FBI files, you learn that Baldwin spent like 3/4 of the 60s in Istanbul. So he finished another country when he got there. The Fire Next Time, perhaps the canonical 20th century text of American race relations, was primarily written in Istanbul. And why did he go there? Well, because a lot of reasons, but one of them that he fell for Engi Jazar. And romantically, that they became blood brothers instead. Engi had played Giovanni in an actor studio rendition of Giovanni's Room in Greenwich Village. Baldwin shows up, draggled in 1961, and within a week, he's finished another country. He goes back there to write Fire Next Time. He writes Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, and he ends up directing a play, Fortune in Men's Eyes, after returning from Hollywood, where he had a whole debacle that we could talk about. But Istanbul became this respite. He talks about this. He needed to go to France in order to get away from American racism. And he needed this sort of linguistic alienation too. He never learned Turkish because he learned French. I think he says, it's only from another place that he could write about America, because when you're in America, there's nothing to compare America to. So this was his, as you said, transatlantic connection.
Yes. But the importance of Baldwin being able to turn into English is a different kind of resource.
Yeah.
When he's in Istanbul, when he's in Paris, even if he's able to speak French, I think is very profound for him. He writes about that in the essay, this nettle danger.
Mm-hmm.
I love how he actually returns to these kind of origin stories that get in advance of himself by the mid-60s, and he rethinks what it meant for him to go to Paris and to learn and to land in Paris not knowing French, right? And how that turns him back into English, and he's able to hear the language and what it's able to do in different kinds of ways. And so I think that the ways in which Istanbul and Paris bring him back into English in inventive ways is really remarkable. But he's also there to explore the world of theater, which is art. And so I'm wondering, how do you make sense of Baldwin's writing in relationship to other mediums, and how these men, his relationships with them, the intimacies he developed with them, opened him up to different mediums? Buford Delaney is a painter, Lucian Habenberger is a painter, Jazar is an actor and a theater producer, and yeah.
Well, Baldwin had some really awful experiences, actually, dealing with theater world and the film world in the 60s. Booster Mr. Charlie was on Broadway, but it was kind of a nightmare dealing with sort of racism of the theater world. And even worse was when he went out to Hollywood in the late 60s. He was hired by Columbia Pictures to write a screenplay. She was working on it up there. He wanted Billy D. Williams to play Malcolm X, but Columbia wanted Charlton Heston to play Malcolm X. So this was not a good thing. But even sort of more sadly, it was when he was out there and he got the phone call that Martin Luther King had been shot and killed. And so it was one of the moments where he almost took his own life. And so he knew that he had to get back to Istanbul as this kind of safe shore. And when he got there, he directed this play, Fortune in Men's Eyes, John Herbert's play, Canadian. This is a really out there play about like homosexuality, homosociality in prisons being performed in a very socially conservative country at that time, in Istanbul. And Dean was in it, but Baldwin called it an act of love. And this was kind of a very healing experience for him, where he was so used to the racism of American the film and especially drama, to have the freedom to connect with these actors and to direct this play really kind of saved his life, as he put it.
I want to come back to that. Now, the last book, in a way, brings us back to how you began this project. So can you talk about Baldwin's relationship with Kazakh?
Yeah, so Yoram Kazak was the illustrator for Little Man. Little Man, and I went over there in 2003. I spent a couple of years going back and forth, interviewing him, and he died in 2005. And with his blessing, the estate's blessing, we moved forward, trying to get Little Man published, which was very hard. At that time, 2005, reading diverse books was still sort of growing, and the publishing industry didn't understand Black English as a possibility for a children's book or a children's book for adults. But Joran Kozak, if you look at the archives in particular at the Schomburg, you realize like what an important figure Baldwin. I mean, he was Baldwin's creative process. He dedicates If Beale Street Could Talk to him, just sort of, I mean, it's fascinating. It tells his beautiful black heterosexual love story between Fonny and Tish, but in some ways it's very much based on his conflicted relationship with Baldwin, with Joran Kozak, who dedicates it to.
How so?
Well, at the time, Joran's wife is pregnant with the child that will become Baldwin's godson, and the novel is narrated by a pregnant black woman, Tish, who sort of sounds a lot like James Baldwin if you read it. And Baldwin often wrote about how writing was like giving birth. And so it's clear that in a way, this children's book is this kind of child, this kind of attempt to keep Joran by his side and this intense love triangle that was happening.
I think one of the more powerful passages in your book occurs when you were writing these chapters about Kazakh, because you turn from the archival into almost like an ethnographer, the ways in which you enter into the narrative itself, and you're making us privy to the kinds of ways you're building relationships with the family. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that shift in method from kind of archival, literary critic to ethnographer, and how do I enter into and make relationships with the people that I'm writing about?
Yeah, it felt important to do so for a couple of reasons. So basically, it reads like a narrative. It's a narratively driven biography for the first three books, and in the fourth book, I suddenly emerge. And why? And it's something that I thought about over the course of many years and tried different things. And there's a couple of reasons. The first is that we sometimes read biographies and we're supposed to believe that there are these objective third-person accounts of a life that are just sort of seamlessly put together. Clearly, that's not the case. And I felt as a white man writing about a black figure, it was important to sort of lay my cards on the table in that way. But I also felt, more importantly, that it was important to show when you're writing about black figures, queer figures, marginalized figures, whatever you want to call them, that recovering these stories takes a lifetime, and that it's an active thing. It's not a passive thing. And so I included those moments. There's this model which is very important, critical fabulation, which is very interesting. But in my case, I was like, wait, I don't want to make anything up. I'm finding these stories that have never been told. But how do I get at what critical fabulation gets at, which is the difficulty of this kind of archival recovery. And this was my solution to that.
Yeah. Could you possibly tell the story that it's in the book, but it's really beautiful, about how your relationship with Beatrice is because it allowed you to really, again, connect the dots between how you began the project with Little Man, and your interest in your relationship with James, and then her understanding of it through some of the archival material that she possessed.
Yeah, this was a really crazy story, kind of, for me, the kind of emotional crescendo of the book, but not necessarily for anybody else. But, no, I'm not going to cry, I'm just saying. So, 2003, I meet Joran Kozak and Beatrice Kozak. It's been many years, we finally got it republished in 2018. In 2017, the Schomburg archives become available, and that's when I realized I'm going to write a larger book. And so I go back over to see Beatrice Kozak, and she lives in Tuscany, near the house that she lived for many years with her husband. And I'm trying to see, she has original illustrations from Little Man, which she did have, but also she had any other archival material. Because I had many conversations with Joran Kozak, but I'd never had there was no correspondence between him and Baldwin. There was no kind of tangible archival evidence in the texture of their relationship. He told me some things which we can get back to, but I've never seen anything archival. So I get to Tuscany, and she lays all of these documents out on her bed, and the sun is setting over the rolling hills, and I see a 7-page manuscript with a metal paperclip, and it's an unpublished love poem that Baldwin had written for Joran called Saturnia, which she had not seen in over 40 years. And it was written in French, because Joran did not speak English. And basically, Saturnia is a hot spring. that Baldwin would go to was Joran. And then Joran would go back to his family, and Baldwin would go back to St. Paul de France, where he bought a house. And Baldwin wrote this book from there, saying it's about waking up in the morning, wondering if he's woken up, has he shaved yet, has he had breakfast. Baldwin reads his own horoscope, he reads Joran's horoscope, the things we've all done. But it's also really about yearning, right? About how he wants him to come home to him, even though in fact he's at his home. So at the end of reading it, he also writes about the camp without him, very intense stuff. And after she finishes reading it, Beatrice says, "Oh, I haven't read this, but reading this makes me sad for Jimmy." And this was a complicated moment for me because what I was in part setting out to do in this book was to push back against a couple narratives about Baldwin. One is this sort of artistic decline narrative that we know all about, but the second one is this kind of vision of him as a tragic figure who never found love and was homosexual and blah, blah, blah. I wanted to look at these networks of relationships that were quite sustaining and complicated and real, but quite important and beautiful in some ways. So, but this was an important moment for me to grapple with the fact that yes, Baldwin did have these difficulties, and not to turn him into a different kind of saint, right? So, and then full circle moment, I went to Schomburg, and they had the copy of Saturnia in English.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. But you raised the question of creativity and Baldwin and love, and a very powerful argument that the book is making, right? About Baldwin's creativity, about the literary legacy he left us, really does hinge on how you understand love, right, as a creative fuel. And I want to share a couple of quotes from the book so that people really get the feel for the argument. As you put it, the emotional part comes through with Baldwin wanting a soulmate and consistently wanting a devoted male lover. And at the same time, the structure of a not fully requited love was a familiar and even eroticized one for Baldwin, and would come to fuel his art, right? And even more boldly, you put it this way, that the allure of same-sex unrequited love was for Baldwin a fetish, structured around an impossibility that also effectively ensured that nothing and no one would ever truly risk interfering with or superseding his calling as a writer. That's a very bold and powerful claim to make. And I'm curious, can you unpack how you see that working? How the structure of unrequited love finds its way and fuels the kind of, not just the writing or the themes that we get in Baldwin's fiction especially, but the structure, like what experiments, what chances is he taking? Because that's a lot of risk to carry into the project.
Yeah, I based that on an interview that I did with Joran Kozak before he died, where I said, Baldwin wanted a long-term relationship with you. What happened? And he burst out laughing, which shocked me because I didn't see that coming. And he said, well, he maybe said he wanted that and thought he wanted that, but in fact he was incapable of that. And in fact, his love was writing, and he would do anything to keep doing that. And I believe I believe in the sense that that's the truth. I also believe, I'm not going to psychoanalyze him, but I believe that there was this kind of this problematic relationship with his stepfather. But I also think that his love for America was an impossible love. And he kept breaking up with America. He kept going back. We're trying to get back together. We're trying to fix the relationship, and then having to leave and go back and leave and go back. So they don't map onto each other perfectly, but there's no question. I mean, he went to the artist residency Yaddo, and he had just broken up with Lucian for like the 75th time. And these letters are extraordinary from there because he gets in a lot of trouble because he runs up this huge phone bill, right? Like $350. And there's another story there about how they were treating him, I think, because he was one of the first African-American artists to come there. But he did rack up this huge phone bill, and clearly he was calling Lucian or calling people about Lucian. And it was at Yaddo that he then writes a letter to Mary Painter, I believe, or Endine, where he says, I was working on this dreadful short story, and now, gosh, I'm here, and I realize it's actually a novel. It's called Giovanni's Room. So clearly this breakup with Lucian was powering this creativity. So that is what I was getting at.
Right, okay. But once he's there, and once he's, say, made the breakthrough of turning a short story into a novel, let's speak about the arguments that you're making for Baldwin as an innovative writer, where the essays aren't, it's not a zero-sum game between reviewing Baldwin the essayist versus Baldwin the novelist, especially with the late fiction.
Yeah.
You know, to push against, as you say, the narrative of decline. So for people who might think, well, I've read Another Country, I've read Yale Street Could Talk, I've even read Just Above My Head, and I don't see a decline there. Can you explain what the narrative of decline was, and then let's talk about how those late works push against that actually.
Yeah, so the narrative of decline was one, just to put it in bold terms, because of racism and homophobia that afflicted the critical establishment, especially in the mid-60s and on, where he was sort of too black for white liberals and too queer for some black critics. That's oversimplification, but that's essentially what was happening. And so they decided that his novels were getting worse, or that, but what I really tried to look at in the book was how much you have to read the novels with the nonfiction. I mean, even if you look at his later drafts at the Schomburg, he's actually, like No Papers for Muhammad, he's working on essays and novels that come out of these sort of amorphous manuscripts that turns into Just Above My Head, that turns into his really important late essay, Freaks in the American Ideal of Manhood. So I really wanted to push against not just the decline, but also the idea that we need to look at him as one thing or the other, that in fact he was both an important novelist and an important nonfiction writer, that they help explain his genesis.
Yes. Because one of the things that strikes me about Baldwin reading in a manuscript and in published form, Commons going to tell it on an album, a novel. Giovanni's Room scratches out short story, a novel.
Little Man, a children's story, and then change it to a children's book, then a children's book for adults. You're right, yeah.
And so I think that the ways in which we can come at him is, Hilton always kind of describes Baldwin's creative process as almost like a Jackson Pollock painting, where he's kind of all over the place because he's able to move in and out of so many different genres and registers at once. And I think he's capable of that. But I also think he's very aware of what the different sources of a different medium, of a different genre have to offer him. And that's why I think, I was curious to hear maybe a little bit more about how you think about his relationship to, say, theater and to cinema. Yes, the project with the Malcolm X screenplay was a debacle with Columbia in every kind of, I want to say, infrastructural sense. But Baldwin always was looking to turn his fiction into films. He was always being solicited to adapt his novels into film. So there's some kind of rapport between him and the project of writing fiction and these other mediums, whether it's cinema, photography, painting. I'm curious to know, how do you see Baldwin as an experimentalist across the mediums? Again, given that so many of these formative relationships were with artists.
Yeah, I think that the theater is in some ways his first passion. I mean, that's what he, junior high school yearbook, that's what he said he wanted to be. He also said fame is the spur, but ouch, right? And fame did hurt him in certain ways. But I think you're right. I think when you look at those, especially those later archives, you see how his final play at the Welcome Table is very much coming out of No Papers for Muhammad, which ends up being Just Above My Head. The final play at the Welcome Table is set in the south of France, and it's about Laverne, a blues singer from New Orleans, who's clearly based on Baldwin again, and it's a cast of characters very similar to his friends. But he was, I think the drama, whether it was, an actual play, kind of the drama of these, sometimes you could say melodramatic love affairs, say, in another country or Giovanni's room. I think that drama was important to him in all of these genres.
Yes, yes, yes. I think we could talk forever, really. So I'm going to put you on speed dial on my cell phone. But for those of you who are here, if you have questions or comments that you want to raise, there'll be a couple of staff here with microphones.
But that compulsion, perhaps, if I heard you correctly, it's the true love. It can't stop.
Can't stop.
Can you a few more examples of that? How that manifests, not just to him, but to people around him?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk in a minute about his process because that gets a little bit to what you're saying. But I think we have to start and go back and see that it wasn't just a compulsion to write. It began as a compulsion to read. The Bible is the only book in his house. And by the time he's 4 years old, he's read it back and forth so much that his mother is deeply concerned. Somehow he gets his hands on Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's afraid he's hurting his eyes. She has to hide it way up high in the bathroom. Right? The teacher, he reads his way through the Harlem Library. He gets taken by a teacher down to the 42nd Street Library. He looks at the lines, he vomits because he's nervous to go inside, but then he reads his way through that. So he was he was reading at 9 years old, he was reading A Tale of Two Cities, and the teachers were like, he could outsmart them about these books. So I think the compulsion began with a compulsion to read, as it does for, I think, many writers. And then I think, there's always something ineffable about what makes an artist tick, but it was so built into his social life. I mean, he would stay up with his friends, whether it was Marlon Brando or Miles Davis or Maya Angelou or Nina Simone, whoever, and he would be drinking and eating and talking, sometimes reading his work out loud to them as well. And then he would stay up all night until the birds came up, and then he would sleep half the day away, and the process would go on. When he was living in Istanbul, Engin and his wife were in the theater, and they would be out performing that night. Then they'd come back and eat with him, and he'd read what he wrote that day, and then this was just in his entire way of moving through the world, which is part of why he had to get away, because how do you do that and also be organizing marches and so on and so forth? So that's part of why I think he lived such a bifurcated life.
You wrote some of those letters
on airplanes. Oh yeah, on airplanes. He took typewriters with him, on these trips on airplanes. Yeah.
I can't. Yes, I can't wait to read this. Sounds so beautiful and so exciting. In the way you tell the story, it sounds like the body of Baldwin's fiction was an autobiography in itself, or thinly veiled autobiography. And I wonder how you grappled with the story he was telling about himself and the one you recovered through archives. Are they the same? How did they diverge? Where are the differences between the way Baldwin may have seen himself and you saw him? Good question. And great to see you. I think, is this Hussein? Oh my God, great to see you. We were undergrads here together many years ago. Here's the thing about Baldwin, that it isn't just his fiction. I mean, in some ways, I think I relied way less on his fiction to for clues into his life, because I think that actually can be a fallacy as a biographer. But I relied a lot on his letters, which are extraordinary. And I relied a lot on his essays. And what's so interesting about him as a writer, even though he died too young, he did have a long career because he started publishing early. So by the time he gets to his later life, he's writing these, No Name in the Street, he's looking back at his earlier life, but even later, that's 1972, in his final essays, like his introduction to The Price of the Ticket, his collected essays, and especially To Crush a Serpent and Freaks in the American Ideal of Manhood, he's going back to his own childhood and re-examining everything, including love, including his early sexual encounters. It's part of why people ask me, are you comfortable writing about this aspect of his life? And I say yes, because he was, and he was publishing about it. I mean, he sort of changed his opinion. People will say, well, earlier in his life, Baldwin said, it's my private life. I don't want to write about it. That was different by the end of his life. And I think if that hadn't been the case, my own approach probably would have been different. But by reading these letters and reading everything sort of with and against each other, there are times when you have to see that Baldwin was a human being and was lying to, deceiving himself like anybody else. So it's not like a direct transcription of what happened. I mean, there are times that he misremembers things. Remember Dorothy Counts, he thought that he was in Paris when she was spat upon, but actually it was a different time. He misremembers all kinds of things because he's a human being, and that's a lot of what the book was getting at, is Baldwin the writer, but also Baldwin the human being.
Right. Can I say, I mean, it's really interesting to think with you about this because it's, in any number of accounts, he will tell us about his coming to Jesus, right? Coming into the church, right?
Yeah.
That we could argue gets fictionalized in John's time on the threshing floor and Go Tell It on the Mountain, but how he tells that event differently by the time he gets to crush a serpent,
Yes.
where he's willing to think about his own interior experience differently.
Right.
And I was wondering then, is there a difference that Baldwin makes between interiority and disclosing interiority versus privacy? Right? Because I think he's committed to an idea of interiority as the means of truth.
Yes, and vulnerability.
And vulnerability.
Yeah.
But privacy can become commodified in the market the way it does. And these are the tensions he's playing out, in his public life as well. So. And
in his writing. I mean, his last novel, not his last novel, but Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone is all about sort of what it means to become a famous Black figure internationally. I mean, it was an actor in the novel. His last play is also similarly about that. These were things that he was actively thinking through later in his life, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I wanted to tell you that the book was amazing. And I have been waiting to meet you even before the snowstorm. I had finished the book. It's been a long winter, but I do want to talk with you about love because James Baldwin represented an endless reservoir of love. And you, with the many pages and information that you shared with us, touched on love in so many aspects. But what really struck me was the selfishness of his love. He always gave so much. So as we think about civil rights, the battles going on here in the States, and his own personal battles, things that were going on with his life, he was never too busy to come back home and work for the betterment of love of his country. And with that said, his cultural iconiness in that particular era and even to this particular day, I can remember how my parents talked about Jimmy. Everybody called him Jimmy and that smile. I just want to know if you could elaborate just a little bit more, possibly if it was something that you did not include in the book, just to talk about the love as he was conflicted when he came home. Obviously, he had to love on his family, but the love that he had to give the country, the love that he gave the civil rights movement, and sometimes the pushback that he was able to accept to not be in the forefront, but still be the leader. If you can talk to that a bit.
Sure,
thank you so much.
That's a great point, because he always said that he, in ways that today I have a hard time, even because he said, I love my country more than any other country in the world. He was an American exceptionalist in some ways. He said, I love my country more than any other country in the world, and that's why I reserve the right to critique her perpetually, So that was the kind of love that he was talking about, was a tough love, right? A difficult love, a love where you're forcing your beloved, as he puts it, to see themselves as you see them, right? Instead of just their own self-projections, right? And fantasies about who they are, which is, of course, the whole problem with white American innocence, et cetera, that he was exploring. So love for him was like a battle. It was a war. It was a growing up. That's how he put it. And when you first said the question, I actually thought you said his selfishness in love. I didn't hear. She said selflessness. Just to be clear, which is interesting because as important as I think everything you're saying is, the love aspect of him, he actually could be selfish in love. And he could be, so for example, his letters to Mary Painter here, like we all can be selfish in love, right? His letters to Mary Painter are striking to the extent that and we only have access to his side of the letters right now, but it's striking that he seems, in these letters, he loves Mary Painter, but he's kind of like utilizing these letters as a place to work through his ideas about his novels and his essays. And you don't get the sense in these letters that he is really asking her about her life, you know? And he loved her, no doubt, but he, you know, again, I think because he was so obsessed with writing and with his call as a witness, that he was willing to kind of turn to these friendships as epistolary lifelines for his writing.
I think we have time for one more question.
That's always difficult. I'm wondering what you can tell us about his mentoring and relationships with American white writers. I guess I'm thinking particularly about William Styron and what part he may have played in the finishing and publishing of the Confessions of Nat Turner.
Great question. Yeah, so Baldwin stayed at his house in Connecticut and finished a couple books there, worked on them there. And he was one of the few people to support that book, The Confessions of Nat Turner. You know, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that Baldwin was that concerned with the younger generation of white writers. I think what Baldwin did, which is extraordinary, actually, it doesn't get enough credit, is that he broke out of this narrative that had been going on for a while, that there could only be one famous black writer, right? It was going to be Richard Wright, him, and Baldwin participated in that for sure, sort of like slaying Richard Wright with those essays. But by the end of his life, he is actually mentoring younger black writers like Cecil Brown, Carl Phillips, Toni Morrison, Gail Jones. He's breaking out of this very gendered dynamic where there can be one man, it has to be a man, and there can be one black writer. And I think that's something he doesn't get quite enough credit for, is what he was doing later in his career. But it went both ways. These women especially also transformed him. He was transformed by black feminists, these conversations that sometimes got fractious with Audre Lorde, Nikki Giovanni. But he was very influenced, for example, by Toni Morrison's dictum, you know, don't write for the white gaze. Well, he stopped writing for the white gaze pretty much at the start of the 70s. So I think he was way more concerned about fostering the next generation of black American writers than the younger generation of white writers, although he was not, you know, dismissive, right?
No, he wasn't dismissive. If anything, they were envious of him or admired him, which is what I'm learning, kind of tracing Baldwin through his publisher's records. You know, people are paying attention to him, even in Joan Didion's Slouching Towards Bethlehem.
Right.
She notices Baldwin, right? In the various essays about the Black Panther, she sees him in the room. And actually, when she passed, she had a list of the 19 books, the 19 writers whose books influenced her the most, and this was a self-curated list. And Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain and Notes of a Native Son were on that list too. He was the only author for whom there were 2 books on her 19, right? So I think that white writers of his peers were paying attention to him.
Yeah. Truman Capote.
Truman Capote.
Very jealous.
Yeah.
Very jealous.
Yeah. And Elia Kazan, actually, who wound up writing a novel, The Arrangements, that became a bestseller. And he's writing Baldwin these very excited letters about what it means to break through into another medium and to become successful as a novelist. And artists at that time see him as a success.
We won't talk about Norman Mailer. That's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah. But Are there any other
Thank you for your question.
questions?
It would be, we would love to continue all these conversations about love and jealousy throughout the rest of the evening. Thank you so much for having this rich conversation with each other and with all of us. I also need to shout out the AFAM Cultural House for partnering with us today, running the live stream, getting the word out about the event. It's wonderful to have you here. And thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here. If you are able to walk this way, around the other side of the mezzanine, that is where we have refreshments, book sales, and signing for you all to enjoy for the rest of the evening. Thank you so much for being here.